All right, so Matt,
Yes.
I sold you a book.
I mean, Spider-Man: Revenge of the Green Goblin.
Yes, that's the one I was referring to.
That is the book you meant. Yes,
So you read it.
I did.
Cool. So we're going to talk about Spider-Man: Revenge of the Green Goblin for a little bit.
Awesome.
I should have put down what year it is. This is like early 2000s.
Right.
So this book that he has, it's just 5 issues, right?
Yes, it's 5.
So there's 5 issues. It's basically a crossover. There's a miniseries, which is the eponymous Revenge of the Green Goblin, and that's written by Roger Stern and drawn by Ron Frenz, 2 classic Spidey people.
Yes.
And then there's an issue of Amazing Spider-Man and an issue of Peter Parker Spider-Man, both respectively number 25. ASM is Howard Mackey and John Romita Jr., and Peter Parker is Paul Jenkins and Mark Buckingham.
Right.
So how about I'll do some more real quick stuff. So this is part of the Next Chapter era, which is when they relaunched, they canceled all the books and relaunched with just 2 main books, Peter Parker Spider-Man and Amazing Spider-Man, with new number 1s in like 1997 or 98 or something like that. And John Byrne and Howard Mackey were the main creative force behind it. John Byrne leaves Amazing Spider-Man after 18, so that's a little bit before this. And Paul Jenkins comes on to Peter Parker at 20, so also a little bit before this. And the next major era of Spider-Man is when J. Michael Straczynski comes on to Amazing Spider-Man at issue 30. So we're kind of in this like period where it's towards the end of the Next Chapter era. And the Next Chapter era, like especially because it's John Byrne, so they wanted to get back to this like more like classic feel of Spider-Man. This is like a year or 2 after the Clone Saga, but the looming like shadow of the Clone Saga was still haunting the Spider-Man titles.
For sure.
So they wanted a new direction, and the overall era is not very positively regarded.
Yeah.
So I guess about what happens in this, and then what are your general thoughts on the story?
Well, in a lot of ways, the story is almost more of a Green Goblin story than a Spider-Man story. It really focuses on Norman and his struggle with the Goblin as he tries to get better, or at least acts like he is, and it shows the relationship between him and Peter and how he sees him as a son, which is really the crux of the entire story.
So do you like it?
Yeah. Overall, I thought it was. I enjoyed it.
Okay.
It's not going to be my favorite Spider-Man stories ever, but I thought it was a cool look at the relationship between classic enemies.
All right. So let's go through. I have a few kind of questions to move the conversation along.
Perfect.
So this one I think is kind of relevant, and this ties into also what's been going on in the Spider-Man titles somewhat recently.
Okay.
So, in your opinion, as a pretty big Spider-Man fan,
I can think so.
who do you think is Spider-Man's arch nemesis? And if I want to throw out options, I'm assuming the 2 major ones that people are going to look to are Norman Osborn and Otto Octavius.
Right. The
so
first
then,
2 I thought of.
Yeah. So then, do you think it's one of those? Do you think it's both? Do you think it's neither? Where do you come down on that?
I think his arch nemesis. It would have to be Norman Osborn. I mean, I think I like Otto better personally, but between like killing Gwen Stacy, the entirety of the Clone Saga, for better or for worse.
I mean, and just to clarify, and the finale of that, so he killed his girlfriend, and then the finale of the Clone Saga, he kills essentially his brother.
Yeah. So I definitely think that Norman would be Pete's arch nemesis.
Yeah. So you talked about how there's like this father-son dynamic.
Yeah.
And when we talked off air a little bit about this story, when you initially finished reading it, I think you mentioned that you identified a few parallels with the Batman-Joker relationship and Killing Joke.
Right.
Can you go into that a little bit?
Especially towards the end, it seemed very reminiscent of the Killing Joke to me, in that they have this. While I guess that is more of lovers
Yeah.
relationship, you could say. This father-son familial relationship, and then I believe it was Norman who straight up says one of us is going to have to kill the other eventually, which is almost pulled straight from there.
Yeah, well, I think in general, it's like both stories have this like kind of idea that the hero and the villain, the central ones, are kind of in this symbiotic relationship. Like they can't exist without each other.
They're connected.
And so Norman says one of us is going to kill each other, and like that's the thing in Killing Joke also. But a lot of the major characterization for Joker in the year since, and especially like Scott Snyder goes really overboard with some of this stuff, is the idea that they will never kill each other.
Right.
Because like one cannot exist without the other, and they have that symbiotic relationship. Do you think that exists with Norman and Peter, or is it different? Because obviously, Norman has been, there are whole decades where Norman is non-existent in the Spider-Man stories.
Right. No, I don't think that's the same. I think that definitely one could kill the other. I mean, Pete's not going to intentionally kill Norman Osborn, but I can definitely
Except in the
see
Ultimate Universe.
I could definitely see that happening, and they'd be fine.
Yeah.
So, kind of on the same topic.
Sure.
Does Peter? Because there's some dialogue in this story that kind of brings this issue up. Does Peter respect Norman Osborn as an adversary and as a fellow man? Because obviously, Batman and Joker, that's another aspect of that relationship. Is like, to what extent do they trust each other? Obviously, a really over the top, like comedic version of that is like that's the core plot of Lego Batman.
Right.
So how do you feel about that in the context of Peter Parker and Norman Osborn?
I think that's kind of interesting, the relationship, from Peter's point of view to looking at Norman. I think in a way he kind of does see him as a father figure, and or has wanted to, because he's a man of science. In a way, he's kind of what Pete isn't and what Pete wants to be when he's not flying around on a fucking Goblin glider.
Yeah.
So I think he respects who Norman could be, but not who he is.
Yeah. I mean, you were talking about how like maybe Peter does to an extent see some of that father linkage.
Yeah.
Like, you want to go into that a little bit more, because in part of this story there are like these moments, these scenes where it's hinted that there is something there on a subconscious level, maybe, where obviously some of it has a sadistic angle. Like there's the scene where Norman has trapped Peter in the dark for a long time, and then he finally at one point like he opens the door, and Peter like gives in for a second, and it's like, no, close the door, let me back into the dark.
Right.
And then obviously there's the thing where Peter doesn't really know his actual dad at all, his biological father.
Yeah.
And Uncle Ben was ripped from his life so quickly. And obviously, as the Goblin and as not outside of the Goblin suit, Norman has been a major presence in his life, just in general, and obviously with the connection with Harry.
Right. Yeah, he and you mentioned that moment where he just for a second gives in and goes back to the dark, which Norman sees as a victory, even though ultimately he doesn't really win. I think it kind of reminds me of, and this might be almost tangential, but his relationship to Otto Octavius in the second Spider-Man movie. I think that is somewhat similar to how he may see Norman.
Yeah, I mean, actually, you brought up the movies, which I didn't think to bring this up until then. I was actually watching like a kind of video essay on the first Spider-Man movie.
Yeah.
Like a few days ago, and in that movie, in the final climax, the death scene for Norman, a lot of the dialogue is very similar to this story.
Don't tell Harry.
Yeah, where like Norman in his final moments, and it's still as Spider-Man and Green Goblin, but they also know each other's identities at this point, where like the Raimi plays up that father-son dynamic.
Yeah.
And I'd have to double check the timeline, but I wonder where Raimi got some of his influences for certain aspects of the film, because obviously he drew from some elements of Death Gwen Stacy,
right?
With the bridge scene and then the final impaled by his own glider.
Yeah.
But I think the timeline around here is very close. I'm guessing, in fact, this story may have been put into the pipeline because of the movie coming out, or vice versa. I'm not sure.
Possibly. And I'm wondering. Also, I don't know the timeline. How much that could be influenced by the Ultimate Universe?
Yeah.
Because I know Ultimate Norman, especially in the Ultimate 6 mini, really sees Pete as like that even more so than this story plays up that idea that Norman sees Pete as his son, his creation.
Yeah. So this is a crossover. Like we said, there's 5 issues, and there's the miniseries, and then 1 issue each of the respective ongoings at the time.
Yeah.
How did you feel about the writing style and the art, if you can go into that, on the different books that were included in this collection? Were there standouts or things you didn't like or things you really liked?
I thought it was consistent. I thought it was consistently good. The bulk of it was written by Stern.
Yeah.
And I think because of that, it had almost an old school feel in a story that was very much not old school, coming off of the Clone Saga. You have Jill Stacy shows up for a couple pages, which is a weird footnote in the Spider-Man mythos. But like even with that, Stern brings a sort of almost old school feeling to the book that I really enjoy it. I really connected to, because I tend to, I don't know, in a way gravitate towards, I don't want to say older Spider-Man, but that's what I grew up with.
All right, so then just to basically ask the same question, but be more specific.
Sure.
Amazing Spider-Man versus the Peter Parker Spider-Man issue. Can you remember like whether you preferred one of those, or whether you thought the writing or the art was stronger in one of those?
Between the two, I don't think anything really stood out. No.
Because I was just curious, because I don't think you haven't read much Paul Jenkins Spider-Man, right?
No, I read a little bit of Spectacular.
Yeah. So yeah, you mentioned Jill Stacy, which I think gets to a point where this story itself doesn't specifically tackle it as much, but this whole next chapter era was another instance where Marvel was really trying to figure out what to do with MJ, with Mary Jane.
Right.
And that relationship. And so, like, you've read all kinds of different eras of Spider-Man. Did you notice, like, the absence of MJ and, like, of that kind of, like, the different parts of that personal life dynamic?
She at this point is dead.
Yeah, she's
dead. She was in a plane crash.
Yep.
And he didn't spend too much time like reminiscing on her. Yeah, I thought it felt odd. His personal life, similar in a way to how it feels now, seemed almost, I don't know, empty.
Yeah.
I think it was okay with this story because, I mean, he spent a good deal of it locked up in a basement. But I'm not necessarily saying that he needs MJ in his life to have a good personal life, but I think he needs something, and that something is definitely not Jill Stacy.
Yep. All right. I think that was most of my notes. Do you have any final thoughts on this story, this era of Spider-Man, etc.?
I think you mentioned it's a weird era, but I think this is a standout story in those handful of years. I think it's a really good Green Goblin story. I think that if one is looking to read something about the Green Goblin, especially how it examines their relationship, his relationship with Pete, I would definitely recommend it. I think it's pretty great.
Yep. All right, so that's our discussion on Spider-Man: Revenge of the Green Goblin. Tune in next time for something else.
Where the hell is Gambit?